Hi, everyone. We're starting the last unit for the course, and that's the unit on psychological explanation. Um, I'm going to today discuss the critique of folk psychology that is found in Paul Churchland's paper, Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes. Before I get to his critique, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about what is at issue, what it is we're addressing in this unit, and then I'll do the critique. There'll be a bit of a sort of preamble-ish sort of part of this before we get to Churchland. Um, so, put in very simple terms, the issue here is whether we should take folk psychology as a science and whether we should take folk psychological explanations as scientific explanations. Now, what is folk psychology and what are folk psychological explanations? Um, I've already defined folk psychology in the past. I'm going to do so again. Um, and I'm going to focus here on what kind of explanations folk psychological explanations are. Okay. By folk psychology, we mean common sense psychology. More specifically, we mean psychology cast in in an ordinary language idiom, right? So let me give an example of a folk psychological explanation of something, right? So suppose that you observe someone uh, raiding their refrigerator and making a pile of sandwiches and gobbling it all down. And you say, "Gosh, why did that guy do that?" And you get the following answer. Well, and suppose the guy's name is John. John was very hungry. John believed that if he ate food, it would satisfy his hunger. John furthermore believed that there was food in the refrigerator, and John wanted to or desired to sate his hunger. Therefore, that's why John went and scarfed a bunch of food out of the refrigerator. Now, clearly, this is some kind of an explanation, right? Once you've been told this, you understand something about John's behavior that maybe you didn't understand before. Specifically, you understand the etiology of that behavior, where that behavior, what made him do that. And the explanation is folk psychological in that you explain the behavior in terms of a number of sensations, beliefs, and desires, all characterized in ordinary language using ordinary language psychological terms like hungry, wanting to eat, wanting to satisfy one's hunger, believing that there's food in the refrigerator, believing that the food will satisfy his hunger, and so on and so forth. Sometimes folk psychology is referred to as belief desire psychology, which is a bit of an oversimplification, but is not a bad one if you don't like the expression folk psychology for some reason or other. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about folk psychological explanations. We're talking about explanations of behavior that are cast in ordinary language terms. All right. Now, a question that philosophers in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology have been fighting over now for decades. I would say going back to Jerry Fodor again, because Fodor probably is the greatest proponent of this view in the positive sense, and I'll see what I mean in a minute. One real question that people have been wanting to get the answer to, is whether or not we should think of these kinds of explanations, these folk psychological explanations, as being a brand of scientific explanation, and thus a form of causal explanation, right? Because scientific explanations are more often than not causal explanations. You want to know the reason for some phenomenon. You want to know why the why the 8 ball went into the corner pocket on the pool table. and you're told, well, it went into the corner pocket because it was struck by the cue ball, and the cue ball was struck by the pool stick that was manipulated by so-and-so. That gives you an explanation of why the 8 ball went into the corner pocket. And notice it's a causal explanation. It's an explanation that accounts for the 8 ball's behavior by referring to antecedent events that caused it to behave in the way that it did. And the question is, should we think of folk psychological explanations that way? Should we think of the mental states of being hungry, believing that there's food in the fridge, believing that the food will satisfy the hunger if eaten, wanting to satisfy the hunger? If all of those states, those mental states, those folk psychological states should be thought of as the causes of that behavior, okay? Now notice, if there are going to be causes, if we're going to say that this is a scientific explanation, at a bare minimum, there have to be folk psychological laws, right? So this particular explanatory schema would fall under a more general explanatory schema that would invoke a folk psychological law that would say something like, if so-and-so wants X and believes that Y will get him X, then all other things being equal, he will pursue Y. Right? That might be what you might call a folk psychological law. And there have to be such laws if those folk psychological explanations are genuinely causal explanations, and thus should be understood as scientific explanations. Because in the case that I gave of the cue ball and the 8 ball, you could give, there would be a scientific law of motion, basically the laws of motion, that would undergird and provide the structure for the specific explanation in terms of pool sticks hitting cue balls and cue balls hitting 8 balls and 8 balls rolling into pockets. Now, Jerry Fodor was a very early proponent and the most famous proponent of the idea that yes, folk psychology is a science. Folk psychological explanations should there be thought of scientific explanations, that there are folk psychological laws, and that explanations like the one I gave about eating the food in the refrigerator are straightforwardly causal explanations that are covered by general folk psychological laws. Okay. Now, there's 2 other ways you can go with this. One way is you can go the way the Churchlands go. And I say the Churchlands because there's Paul Churchland and his wife, Patricia Churchland, and they work together and largely share the same view. You could go the way the Churchlands go, and you could say, look, we accept that these are scientific explanations, but they're lousy ones. It's bad science. More strongly, it's false science. Right? That's what the Churchlands are going to say. But you also might deny that folk psychological explanations are scientific explanations at all. You might deny that folk psychology should be thought of as a science. And you might think of these as a different sort of explanation, as providing a different kind of explanation than the sort of explanation you get in the case of the cue ball and the 8 ball. Right? Now, I'm going to reserve that option towards the end, because if you want just my own view is that it was a mistake. It was a mistake to assimilate folk psychological explanations with scientific / causal explanations. That was a mistake from the get-go. And that once you went down that road, you inevitably were going to discover that this was not particularly good science, right? But that's not the way the majority of the people have gone, right? The majority of people either are on Fodor's side and say, oh, these are scientific explanations and they're great, no problem with them. Or people have gone the Churchland route and have said, yeah, these are scientific explanations, but it's bad science. It's like other older scientific theories that we've since chucked. Okay? And so the majority position is to take folk psychology as a science, to take folk psychological explanations as scientific explanations, as causal explanations, and then the disagreement is over whether it's good science or bad science. What I'm going to want to suggest at the end is that maybe this whole way of thinking about it is a mistake, and that they shouldn't have been thought of as scientific explanations to begin with. That is a view that I have been working through myself in my own work, and in a lot of my public intellectual work. And later on down the road, maybe I'll put some links to some stuff that I've written along those lines. But I want to do that at the very end of the unit. I don't want to do that before we work through sort of the mainstream literature on this. Okay. So now we're ready to go to the Churchland's critique, and the Churchland's critique really has 4 parts. The first is to acknowledge that folk psychology is a scientific theory. The second is to claim that nonetheless it is a false theory. The third is to say that because it is a false theory, its ontology doesn't exist. That is, there aren't actually any folk psychological states. There are no beliefs, there are no desires, these are just ways of, ordinary ways of speaking that don't actually correspond to anything in the world, right? They're archaic ways of approaching what should be approached through more modern scientific idioms. And then the fourth is that eventually folk psychology will be entirely replaced by neuroscience. Not that it will reduce to it, because the Churchlands are anti-reductionists, right? But that eventually neuroscience will be able to explain everything about behavior that we want to know. And everything about human psychology that we'll want to know. Those are the 4 elements of the critique. Now, the logic of the critique has what I'm going to say is fundamentally 3 elements. Okay. The Churchlands are going to say you can't just look at the explanatory successes of folk psychology. You also have to look at its explanatory failures. That's number 1. And Churchland is going to say that the explanatory failures outweigh and outnumber the explanatory successes. The second is that we need to look at folk psychology as part of the larger history of science and hypothesize as to its future potential given that history. Right? And lastly, we need to think about how folk psychology sits with, whether it coheres with, what all the other sciences are starting to tell us about human nature. Right? So we don't just examine human nature through psychology, we also examine it through neurology, we examine it through physiology, we examine it through biological anthropology, we investigate, there's a whole bunch of different sciences that take up questions pertaining to human nature, and they're all telling us a bunch of stuff about human nature. And the question is, how well does what folk psychology tells us cohere with what all those other things are telling us, all those other sciences are telling us? Because Churchland is going to take it as a condition of adequacy for science that it cohere with what the rest of science is telling us. That science can't be an outlier and yet be a productive science. Right? In other words, if chemistry didn't cohere with physics, that would be a problem, right, for chemistry. Or if biology somehow was wildly at odds with what physics and chemistry tell us about life. If biology told us something completely wildly different that didn't really seem to have anything to do with what chemistry and physics were telling us about organisms, right? That would be a problem for biology, right? And so Churchland wants to say, we need to also see, in addition to explanatory success and failure, in addition to its place in the history of science and its potential future, it's also relevant to know how folk psychology fits with what all the other sciences are telling us about human beings. Okay. Now, the explanatory successes of folk psychology are pretty obvious, right? I mean, if you think about all the times you employ belief, desire psychology, it often does not just explain, but predict behavior, right? If you know that somebody's been starving all day, they're starving and haven't eaten all day, and you know that they know there's food in the refrigerator, and you know that they don't like being hungry, you could predict that they're going to go and get food out of the fridge, and that prediction is very likely to be correct, right? So folk psychology's successes are sort of obvious, but Churchland also wants to talk about folk psychology's failures, and he lists these failures on page 73. Okay, so I'm just going to read you a list of the things that Churchland points out folk psychology does not tell us anything about. Right, so this is the second major paragraph on page 73, and I'm just going to go ahead and read from it. Quote, so these are all things that, as he says, remain largely or wholly mysterious within the framework of folk psychology. One, the nature and dynamics of mental illness, the faculty of creative imagination, the ground of intelligence differences between individuals, the nature and psychological function of sleep, the common ability to catch an outfield fly ball on the run or to hit a moving car with a snowball, the internal construction of a 3D visual image from subtle differences in the 2D array of stimulations in our respective retinas, the rich variety of perceptual illusions, the miracle of memory. On these and many other mental phenomena, folk psychology sheds negligible light. So Churchland doesn't deny that folk psychology does explain some things and allows us to make some successful predictions, but he says there's way more things that it fails to explain. There's way more things it tells us nothing about whatsoever. So that's the question of explanatory failure, and Churchland is going to maintain that folk psychology's explanatory failures are greater in number and in magnitude than its successes. Okay, now the second question has to do with folk psychology's history, and this he discusses from pages 74 to 75. And he paints a certain picture. This is actually a very similar picture to what B.F. Skinner paints in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which we didn't read. For Churchland, the history of folk psychology is a history of stagnation. And of stagnation and of shrinking of its explanatory domain. So as Churchland points out, we used to offer folk psychological explanations for everything, not just for human behavior, but for the behavior of everything in nature, right? That is, we used to ascribe intentions, aims, desires to inanimate objects in physics. So if you go back to ancient Greece and you were to ask someone like Aristotle why a rock falls when you drop it, he would say that the rock belongs down in the earth and not up in the air, and so when left alone, it will seek out where it belongs. Okay, that is a kind of folk psychological explanation of the behavior of the rock. And Churchland is correct to point out that in the ancient world, in primitive early science, we explain everything this way. The whole idea of explaining things in terms of purely mechanical causes governed by a series of general laws, that's a product of the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Prior to that, all explanations of phenomena in nature were folk psychological to some degree and to some extent. That then shrunk. So by the time you get then to the Enlightenment, by the time you get to the 17th and 18th centuries, you have the scientific revolution. Now the rest of nature is explained in mechanical terms. So now it's only human behavior that now is explained in folk psychological terms. So that's a shrinking of folk psychology's explanatory domain. So one thing about its history that Churchland notes, its explanatory domain has shrunk radically. Second thing that Churchland points out, there's been virtually no progress in folk psychological accounts. Right? That is, the kind of explanation you give for why somebody got food out of the icebox, right? or why somebody ate food, period, is going to be pretty much the same one that you would have gotten from somebody in ancient Greece. And so for Churchland, that demonstrates a stagnant science, a science that has not progressed, right? Think about how much physics has progressed in terms of the kinds of explanations you give, right? I mean, the kind of explanations we were given for motion in the days of Isaac Newton compared to the explanations for motion that we get out of Einstein, right? Or gravity, right? The count of gravity completely changed, right? From being thought to be a force in the day of Newton to now being understood as being an effect of the warping of space by bodies of certain mass, right? Physics has evolved its explanations tremendously. They become stronger, more powerful, more sophisticated, more advanced. They can explain more. Folk psychology is exactly the opposite. It explains less, and it explains it pretty much the same way it explained it 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So not only is its domain of explanation shrinking, its explanations have remained stagnant. The last thing has to do with coherence with other sciences. And Churchland wants to say that increasingly folk psychological accounts of human nature are outliers, are outlier accounts, right? And let me just read you what he says about this, because he says it in a way that's better than I can paraphrase it. It's powerful the way he puts it. This is on page 75. Quote, this is the third paragraph. If we approach Homo sapiens from the perspective of natural history and the physical sciences, we can tell a coherent story of his constitution, development, and behavioral capacities, which encompasses particle physics, atomic and molecular theory, organic chemistry, evolutionary theory, biology, physiology, and materialistic neuroscience. That story, though still radically incomplete, is already extremely powerful. The greatest theoretical synthesis in the history of the human race is currently in our hands. Parts of it already provide searching descriptions and explanations of human sensory input, neural activity, and motor control. But folk psychology is no part of this growing synthesis. Its categories stand magnificently alone without any visible prospect of reduction to that larger corpus. So the last sort of part of the critique is that folk psychological explanations don't cohere with the explanations we're getting from any of the other sciences. The picture that folk psychology paints of the human subject and of human behavior is completely separate from and not assimilable with the converging picture that is coming from all the physical and from all the natural sciences, and that this is yet a third reason to think that folk psychology is false. Okay. Now, it's this last point about the lack of prospect of a reduction. So the Churchlands are going to agree that you cannot reduce folk psychology to neuroscience or to biology. But the Churchlands don't take that as evidence that folk psychology is autonomous. They take that as evidence that folk psychology is false. And more so, they take it as evidence that folk psychology's ontology doesn't exist. Because there is no neurological or lower level counterpart to a folk psychological state like believing there's food in the refrigerator or wanting to eat, right? They say that that shows that there's no such thing as wanting to eat, and there's no such thing as believing that there's food in the refrigerator. That these are just old, ordinary language ways of describing things that no longer apply. That we have a much more sophisticated materialist ontology now, and that and the sciences to which that belongs are going to do the work that folk psychology used to do. Okay. That's why the Churchlands are called eliminative materialists rather than reductive materialists. They don't seek to reduce the categories and explanations of folk psychology. They seek to eliminate the categories and explanations of folk psychology. Now, there's a few things I just want to keep you in mind. I want you to keep in mind as we go forward. First, with respect to the explanatory failures that Churchland describes, it's worth asking yourself whether folk psychology ever even intended or aimed to explain that kind of phenomenon. Now, whether that matters or not is, is debatable, right? But it's worth asking yourself, is this a fair criticism? Did folk psychology ever say it was going to explain how we can catch a fly ball, right? Or it's going to explain how memory can work, how memory works? So it's fair to ask that, right? Here's another thing that's worth asking. What are the conditions under which where we simply say that a particular theory is false, but its ontology exists nonetheless, right? And is going to be explained by some other better theory, versus a theory is false and the ontology doesn't exist. So let me give you an example of each. So take what was called the caloric theory of heat. It used to be thought that what makes an object have a certain temperature is the presence inside the object of something called caloric fluid. That's where the word calorie comes from, incidentally. Okay. That when something is 100 degrees or 50 degrees or whatever, it's because of this caloric fluid that's inside it that explains its temperature. Well, the caloric theory of heat was replaced by the mean molecular motion theory of heat, right? We now know that the temperature of an object has to do with how fast or slowly its constituent molecules are moving, right? Now, in that case, the theory change also involved the elimination of the old ontology, right? Nobody thinks that there's such a thing as caloric fluid. There is no such thing as caloric fluid, right? So there you have an example where a change of theory also entailed an elimination of the previous ontology. But let me give you an example where that's not the case. So let's take the old astronomy of Ptolemy, right? The Ptolemaic astronomy, according to which the Earth was at the center and the sun and the other planets revolved around it, right? And there was all sorts of things that had to be adjusted to explain for the motions of things that they were able to adjust through various theories having to do with epicycles and all sorts of other stuff. And actually, it made pretty decent predictions for the time. Now, of course, with Copernicus and later Galileo, this was changed. We went from a geocentric to a heliocentric. We gave a different account of planetary motions and so on and so forth. But notice something. We didn't eliminate the Ptolemaic ontology. We didn't say, well, that shows that there aren't any planets. Right? The falsity of Ptolemaic astronomy shows not only that it provides bad explanations, but that its ontology, i.e. the planets, don't exist. Right? We still think that there are planets, and our new astronomical theories are there to explain the behavior of those planets. So it's worth asking. Let's refer to the first kind of change where the rejection of a theory also involves the rejection of its ontology. Let's call that ontologically radical theory change. And let's call the second, where a change in theory does not entail a change in ontology, ontologically conservative theory change. It is worth asking, under what conditions should we think the theory change is ontologically radical and theory change is ontologically conservative? The Churchlands just assume that the theory change here should be ontologically radical, but it might be worth asking, well, why should we think that, given that we have examples of theory change that are ontologically conservative? That's worth asking also. It's also worth asking, just in general, what commits us to an ontology to begin with? Right? What makes us think that there are these things or that there aren't those things? Right? That's something we're also going to have to talk about. All of these things are going to be taken up in John Greenwood's reply to the Churchlands, okay, and his thoughts in general on this subject. And I'm going to talk about those. in the next video. So we're going to talk about Greenwood in the next video, but we're also still going to be talking about the Churchlands because much of this is a back and forth. All right, I hope that you found this interesting and at least somewhat comprehensible, and I will see you in the next one. All right, take care. Bye-bye.